Good morning. My name is Mark Bissonette, and I'm a public diplomacy officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Canberra. As the United States strives to build back better, the Biden administration has put our fundamental values of equality and diversity into practice to revitalize our democracy. The clearest example of the administration's commitment to these values can be seen in the unprecedented race and gender diversity amongst its senior leadership. While prioritizing equitable representation in these roles is a notable decision, it represents only a small step in our effort to achieve true equality and live up to our core values. In other words, we still have work to do. To that end, U.S. Mission Australia has convened two phenomenal speakers for this edition of our Diplomacy Delivered series. It is no secret that the United States has struggled and continues to struggle with race relations, but these are challenges we deal with out in the open. We don't ignore our shortcomings and we don't sweep them under the rug. We confront them for the world to see. It's how we make progress. Before getting to the introductions, let's cover a few housekeeping items. As attendees, you'll have your video and microphones automatically turned off. This helps keep the sound quality clear and reduces interference. If you'd like to ask a question today, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat function won't be monitored for questions. It's there for you to use for discussion. This webinar is being recorded. If you don't want to be named in the recording, please feel free to submit your question anonymously. Lastly, while the program is sponsored by the U.S. Embassy, the views of our speakers are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government. We do, however, fully endorse having these important conversations as they are the bedrock of a healthy democracy. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's session, Alan Wu. From working alongside Canberra high school students to challenging world economic leaders in Davos, Alan has been a lifelong champion for a more participatory and inclusive society. He is the longest serving member of the board of directors of Oxfam Australia, one of Australia's largest international development organizations. He also serves on the board of the racial justice organization Democracy of Color, in addition to serving as a senior advisor with the Open Government Partnership, a multilateral project co-founded by the Obama administration to make governments more inclusive, responsive, and accountable. Thanks for joining us today, Alan. I'll now turn it over to you to tell us more about today's program and to introduce Dr. SunAh Laybourn. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you all for joining us in this event of the U.S. Embassy's Diplomacy Delivered series. This series aims to foster dialogue between Australians and Americans on issues that directly affect our shared democratic values. Today, as Mark mentioned, we'll be talking about race in the U.S. and the Stop Asian Hate movement, and this coincides with Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month in the U.S. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands from where we are dialing in today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I particularly like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, the traditional owners of Brisbane, from where I'm joining you all today. So when the pandemic hit, there was a galvanizing sense of solidarity in communities around the world that we were in this together, followed perhaps by a disappointing realization that this crisis too would serve to exacerbate existing inequalities and place further stress on those folks already marginalized. The pandemic hit the US in the midst of its most recent reckoning with racial disparities, Black Lives Matter, a necessary and confronting conversation that continues today. More recently, another group, Asian Americans, have become an additional focus of racial animus, both in the US and Australia. Asian Americans have long been seen as a model minority. On the whole, they're more likely to have university degrees and have higher family stability than other racial groups. But recently, Asian Americans, their homes and their businesses have been the target of abuse and violence. Assaults are accompanied by racist insults like, "You are the virus," "You are infected," "Go back to China," and "You're the one who brought the virus here." The not-for-profit group Stop AAPI Hate, which tracks racist attacks against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, recorded almost 4,000 incidents over the first year of the pandemic. According to the New York Police Department, hate-fueled attacks on Asian Americans rose 1,900% in New York in 2020. This is a city known for being diverse and tolerant, and in a national context where overall hate crimes have decreased. And this may not represent the full scale of the problem, as many incidents go unreported. Here in Australia, the Asian Australian Alliance has reported similar surges of anti-Asian violence, with 520 reports in the year to April 2021. In March, the Lowy Institute released the findings of a survey that found that nearly 1 in 5 Chinese Australians had experienced physical racist assaults during the pandemic. The annual Scanlon Foundation Mapping Social Cohesion report also found that there's been heightened negative sentiment towards Chinese nationals over 2020 and 2021. 44% of respondents said that they had somewhat or very negative views towards Chinese Australians, a nearly threefold increase from 13% in 2013. In response, affected communities and allies are mobilizing to stop Asian hate. And over the next hour, we'll examine their response and what's still to come and what I reckon will be a really fascinating conversation. We'll talk about how anti-Asian sentiment has developed and manifested in the US, the intersections between Stop Asian Hate and Black Lives Matter, and what social and policy changes we need to see if we're serious about building back better. To work through these issues with me, we're joined by Dr. SunAh Laybourn, the assistant professor at the University of Memphis Department of Sociology. At 4 months, SunAh was adopted by a white military couple and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in sociology, SunAh worked as the case manager for the Tennessee Department of Children's Services. Her graduate research examined the effects of ideologies about race, family, and national belonging on Korean adoptees' individual and collective identity formation. And her current work examines how Asian Americans publicly engage with racialized immigrant narratives in their fights for social justice. SunAh joins us today from Memphis. This will be a terrific conversation, and I'm glad to have you all here with us. As Mark has mentioned, please use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the conversation. I'll be posing them to SunAh throughout the discussion today. But first, some opening observations from SunAh.
Good morning. Thank you so much to the U.S. Embassy in Canberra for this invitation. Thank you for Mark and everyone at the embassy for organizing this. And thank you so much to Alan for that introduction. I will give about 15 minutes of remarks about the Stop Asian Hate movement in the U.S. And then I'm very much looking forward to a robust discussion with Alan and with all of you. So I'm going to pull up my screen and we will get started. All right. So there we go. On March 16th, 2021, a series of mass shootings took place at massage spas or massage parlors in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, Georgia, in the southeastern part of the United States. Robert Aaron Long, a 21-year-old white male, ultimately killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, and wounding 1 other person. Now, this event brought mainstream attention to what many Asians in America and around the world were already aware of, and that is rising anti-Asian violence in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Partly, this violence was fueled by anti-Asian rhetoric by government officials around the world, including a series of derogatory and inflammatory and stereotypical comments about Asians, but then also partly fueled by economic anxieties and fears of an economic downturn due to a global health crisis. But what we know is that anti-Asian sentiment was ongoing prior to this highly publicized mass shooting on March 16th. And in fact, Stop API Hate, as Alan mentioned, was tracking hate incidents from early March of last year throughout and continuing this year, tracking about 7,000 incidents through March of 2021, compared to roughly about 100 incidents annually in previous years. And in fact, in the first 2 months of 2021, Stop API Hate tracked 1,000 incidents of anti-Asian violence. And this included verbal harassment and shunning, physical assaults, civil rights violations, and online harassment. And we think about the national trends in the US, we know that a large percentage of these incidents took place in the public square, so public streets, parks, residential areas, and businesses. We know that women made up about 65% of targets in these reports, and that Chinese individuals have reported the most hate incidents out of other Asian ethnic groups. So before we move any further, I just want to very quickly touch on a little bit of information about who Asians in America are. So Asians in America comprise about 23 million, or about 7% of the US population. representing or having ties to over 20 countries, and are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the United States, estimated to reach over 46 million by 2060. And Asians in the United States reside across all regions of the US, but primarily in the Western region of the United States. And when we look at the reports of hate incidents, we know that California is reporting the largest number of hate incidents at 40%, and then New York, the next largest number of hate incidents at 15%. And what this really tells us is that it mirrors historic immigration flows to the US. So thinking about Angel Island and Ellis Island, the immigration processing centers on the West Coast and East Coast, respectively. And while Asians in America number about 23 million, only 6 origin groups make up 85% of all Asian Americans, with Chinese Americans comprising about a quarter. And this is important for thinking about these ties to, again, historic immigration flows, but also as we think about who or how Americans think about Asians in America. So very much this strong idea that Asians in America are only Chinese, right? And what that means as we think about historic stereotypes about Asians in America, which I'm sure we'll have time to talk about later as well. Now, I started these comments talking about the March 16th shooting. And that's because it was the most widely circulated mass shooting in regard to Asian Americans up until this point in the pandemic. But as the data from Stop AAPI Hate indicated, at the beginning of this year, we saw a even rising number or more rising number of anti-Asian violence happening. And so in late January, early February, there was a 7-day period where particularly violent and in some cases deadly attacks were happening. So for instance, a Thai man was attacked in his neighborhood. Ultimately, he died from his injuries. A 91-year-old man was pushed to the ground in Oakland's Chinatown. A 70-year-old woman was attacked again in Oakland, California. And this was part of a series of about a couple dozen attacks against Asian elders that had been happening in this part of the United States. And then we saw a Filipino man slashed across the face by a box cutter as he was riding the train in New York City. So these very violent and deadly attacks all happened within a span of 7 days, but mainstream media wasn't connecting the dots between these events and wasn't talking about the rising anti-Asian violence. Now, to be sure, in these communities where these attacks were happening, we already saw organizing, marches, protests, and vigils happening in January and February of this year, already organizing around this idea of Stop Asian Hate. So because of this kind of 7-day series of very violent attacks, we saw Asian American activists and organizers taking to social media to call out mainstream media's lack of attention to rising anti-Asian violence and then to these attacks in particular. And I just wanted to feature these 2 social media posts because these were ones that generated millions of retweets, millions of shares, and that ultimately led to Asian American activists being interviewed on a variety of mainstream news sources. And this was happening in mid-February, late February to early March. And I think it's important to add this into the conversation because the March 16th shooting, again, was the first kind of mainstream coverage of anti-Asian violence, but this organizing and advocacy had been happening in the months prior. And so I think that's important to think about as we consider what this movement is becoming, where it's going, to consider how it started as well. Now, because of these media features, these interviews, again, talking about rising anti-Asian violence, even talking about histories of anti-Asian sentiment, but not necessarily foregrounding the Stop Asian Hate movement that was starting to formulate. We saw other Asian American activists and celebrities or influencers also making mention of this movement that was starting to form. And I just wanted to feature Jeremy Lin. He's an NBA player, but because his post really, I think, distills some of the main themes that were starting to emerge in advocacy around Stop Asian Hate. So he says, something is changing in this generation of Asian Americans, changing in regards to calling out racism that Asian Americans are experiencing, but also reframing what it means to be American and what it means to be Asian American as well. And so these, again, were happening before this March 16th mass shooting. And as part of these conversations, we also saw Asian American activists really grappling with issues around what does justice look like for Asian American communities in relation to other social justice movements and other demands by racially minoritized groups. So, I mean, just the headline of this article, I want justice for anti-Asian violence, but not at the expense of Black people. So when we think about the on-the-ground grassroots organizing that has been ongoing, not just this year, but in years prior, we're also thinking about how folks are very much considering Asian American advocacy and justice for Asian Americans in context with and alongside other racially minoritized groups. And I think sometimes this gets left out of mainstream media coverage. But we saw Asian American advocates really centering this discussion, using their platforms to talk about anti-Asian hate in the context of white supremacy and not framing it as Black Asian antagonism, which we have seen some media view it in that way or cover it in that way. So in addition to kind of think pieces, we also saw a variety of webinars that were planned before the March 16th shooting that were very much directly talking about anti-Asian violence, but also Black and Asian solidarity historically, but also contemporarily as well. And so now I want to bring it back to the March 16th mass shooting in Atlanta, because I see it as very central to mainstream understandings of the Stop Asian Hate movement. And this mass shooting, again, because it was covered across media sources, right? Pretty much any local news station was covering it or mentioning it in some way. And of course, mainstream media outlets covering this event as well. But I see it as a catalyzing event, so a turning point event, really launching the Stop Asian Hate movement into mainstream consciousness. So again, thinking about this movement as happening in communities across the US, but not maybe in mainstream understanding. Also a turning point or a catalyzing event for many Americans who were surprised to learn that Asian Americans experience racism. Also a politicizing event. So thinking about Asian Americans in particular, so for folks who maybe had not been politically engaged up until this point, a politicizing event for them. Also a way to think about a joint cause amongst Asian ethnic groups in America, but also a joint cause across racial groups in the United States as well. And finally, the Atlanta shooting was taken as an awareness raising, educational, and oppositional event. Awareness raising, again, raising awareness that Asians in America experience racism. Educational in the sense that many Asian Americans, again, use their platforms to connect those dots between the Atlanta shooting and past instances of anti-Asian sentiment, anti-Asian legislation and policy throughout US history, but also an oppositional event in that Asian Americans are able to reclaim and start to reframe, again, what it means to be Asian American, to challenge the idea of Asian Americans as a monolith or as model minorities or as politically disengaged. Now, it is important, I think, to note a couple of elements about the Stop Asian Hate movement, in that it is part of a broader movement to dismantle white supremacy. And I think this is important because in the Stop Asian Hate movement, it is not just about individual interactions or individual instances of hate. Yes, to be sure, people do want justice for lives that are taken, but connecting these interactions to broader systems of oppression and to rethinking safety, justice, and community care outside of frameworks of policing. So thinking about the Stop Asian Hate movement and its relationship to Black Lives Matter, or even just the policy changes that Black Lives Matter has been advocating for over the past several years. So again, thinking about defunding the police, or even abolishing the police altogether, or thinking about other ways to ensure community safety and care outside of a police state. And again, this being linked to, of course, broader coalitional politics as well. So very briefly, I just want to talk about two ways where we can see some outcomes or movements happening already in relation to Stop Asian Hate advocacy. So one, just recently, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act and the No Hate Act amendments were passed in the Senate. And both of these pieces of legislation designate a Department of Justice member to analyzing hate crimes, to addressing hate crimes, and also dedicating resources to track and report hate crimes as well. And then finally, because white supremacy impacts us in a variety of ways, from thinking about legislation or policies, but also within that cultural or interpersonal realm, right? How we think about who Asians in America are. We also see the Asian American and Pacific Islander Visibility Pledge, which is a way for folks to pledge their commitment as an ally to the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, to also self-educate about Asian American and Pacific Islander history, but also contemporary experiences, and then to do your part to stop white supremacy by speaking out against both anti-Blackness and anti-Asian hate. So when we think about the Stop Asian Hate movement, I think it's important to think about it as happening and preceding the March 16th shooting, even though that was a very catalyzing, obviously a very publicly covered event, and to also think about some of the outcomes already of this advocacy. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to chatting with you, Alan, and then also with all of you who are with us this morning.
Thanks, SunAh. That's a great a lot to think into and to unpack. Let me start though with this. I mean, how does it feel to be Asian American in the US today? How are communities coping, and what is the focus of their conversations?
Yeah, I mean, such a great question. So I'm often reminded of this quote by a prominent Japanese American, and this was something he said in the 70s. And he said, Asian Americans feel like we're a guest in someone else's house, that we can never really relax and put our feet up on the table. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, I've often thought about this quote because that's how it feels to be Asian in America, that you can't really relax, that you're always reminded that you're not really American, regardless of your nationality or citizenship status. But I think one thing that has happened as a result of the rising anti-Asian violence is more community connections and more community care. So of course, we know there have been vigils across the US, particularly in light of the March 16th shooting, to both mourn those lives that were lost, but also just to collectively mourn what Asians in America have been experiencing, but maybe haven't felt that they could even talk about or express. So we know that a lot of incidents of anti-Asian hate go unreported, right? And we know that in the United States, race and racism is often looked through a Black-white lens, leaving little room for Asians to even talk about these experiences. So there's also a way that everything that has happened in the last year has also created a space for Asian Americans to collectively grieve, which I think is so important, just in the context of COVID overall, but obviously in the context of anti-Asian violence too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, both Australia and the US have, had long had Asian populations, and they've been the target of anti-Asian sentiment as more generalized xenophobia. In terms of this most recent surge in antipathy, you talked about a few factors: the pandemic, economic anxieties inflamed by public comments about the culpability of Asians in causing the situation. Is that the right way of thinking about the causes of this wave of difficulty? Or should we, is there a better way of thinking more broadly about some of the systems of power and oppression?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many kind of elements that are converging at this particular time, right? So to be certain, it does not help when the leader of your nation is making derogatory and inflammatory comments about Chinese people or Chinese Americans. So that certainly emboldens people to use that same type of language. And it, of course, certainly doesn't help when there are fears of economic anxiety, because we know people look for a scapegoat or look for some way to express their frustration. But even to your point, more broadly speaking, we also know in the US context, increasing inequality that has been ongoing. So people are already feeling economic frustrations because of that, because of lack of support, lack of financial support, lack of resources in our communities, and lack of jobs, right? All of these things are contributing to a general experiences or general feelings of fear, frustration, and anxiety. So I don't think we can pinpoint it on, one specific thing, but rather a confluence of factors.
Yeah, I mean, and quickly on that, I mean, I don't want to derail the conversation because I don't think this is the focus of our discussions today, but I think there are, some legitimate concerns with, say, the policies and practices of the Chinese government, both from the US and Australian perspective, both domestically and abroad. Is there a way to talk about some of those concerns legitimately without inadvertently inflaming prejudices against Chinese Australians or Americans and other Asian communities in the US? What advice would you give to folks?
Yeah, I think it's very tricky because, especially when thinking about, criticism or critique of Chinese government, right? And drawing that thin line between who or what we're talking about. So many of these kind of bigger issues require nuance and require a level of kind of information or understanding that is hard to convey, maybe in some of the ways that we might want to speak out against these things. I'm thinking particularly about social media, since that is a very popular way to kind of express our opinions. And it can be difficult to talk about some of these more complex issues and separate it from how folks might interpret it or apply it to then generalize against a whole racial or ethnic group.
I want to go back to just those opening remarks that you had around, not feeling at home in the only place we've ever really known to be home, and the idea of Asian Americans and Asian Australians, I guess, being a model minority. I mean, that is a focus and status that I imagine that many of us would have felt safe in, because while a minority, at least there was a general impression that you were doing quite well and contributing to our societies. How useful is that how accurate is it, and how useful is it as a concept?
Great question. So I think it is not useful at all. It's not helpful at all. It's not helpful to Asian Americans, and it's certainly not helpful to other racialized minorities in the US, if we think about the US context in particular. I mean, we can just think back to the creation and kind of the origins of the model minority myth in the US, coming at a time where we see the civil rights movement happening, and we see Black Americans in particular fighting for and advocating for their rights. And in the midst of this, we see this model minority myth originating as a way to say, look at these Asians in America, look at these other racial minorities who had no help from the government, had no assistance, but they've quote unquote made it. And the model minority myth was created as a way to really disparage the Black community and to try to dismantle what they were fighting for and say that they should, do things the way that quote unquote Asians have done it, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and that type of thing. And that myth is so sticky, right? Like it has continued and it has persisted, and it is inaccurate. When we think about the Asian American ethnic groups in the United States, what we know is that the biggest, largest gaps in equality, or the biggest inequalities, I should say, are between Asian ethnic groups. But we don't think about Asian ethnic groups as being anything other than the model minority. And so we don't see how specific Asian ethnic groups, particularly Southeast Asians in the United States, are far behind the national average on educational and income, right? But it's hard to get support and to get resources for these communities when so much of the framework for understanding Asians is, oh, you've made it, right? So it's particularly harmful when we think about getting support, getting resources for those in need, and when we also think about broader social justice movements as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that myth has allowed Asian communities to avoid some of the very harshest edges of racism, to fly under the radar a bit. But it has been used as a weapon to oppress other racial groups. And as you say, it's brittle. It falls away when there's a sort of slightest anxiety, and it's inaccurate too. With that, and you touched upon this briefly in your remarks too. You talked about Black Asian antagonism. Can you explain the dynamics between the African American and Asian American communities and how that's playing out today?
Yeah. So there are a few different ways, right? So I want to talk about on the ground, but then also kind of these broader kind of cultural constructions about Black Asian solidarity or Black Asian antagonism as well. So on the ground, right, in communities, we see folks trying to build coalition, and we do see coalitions, right, across these racial lines. And we see a lot of care, and we see a lot of consideration and work going into these relationships. But more broadly, if we think about how Black Asian relationships have been construed, we think a lot around points of antagonism, points where we've seen violence across communities. And that, again, if we think about what's sticky in kind of just the general understanding, that is kind of what's sticky, that there is intense dislike or hatred or animus between these two communities. Now, to be sure, there have definitely been instances of anti-Blackness or anti-Asian racism, again, thinking about cross-racially Asian and Black communities. But I think only thinking of those instances really obscures the ways that Asian Americans and Black Americans are coming together, are fighting for one another, and are trying to dismantle white supremacy together, still staying attuned to the ways that white supremacy oppresses each group in very distinct and different ways.
John Ziegler had just asked a question in the Q&A around the profile of a typical anti-Asian hater. I mean, do we know where those pockets of anti-Asian sentiment are stronger?
So we do know, of course, just looking at the Stop AAPI hate data, thinking about regionally where those pockets of anti-Asian hate are happening. Again, thinking about areas where there are large and historic or long-standing communities of Asian Americans as well. And also what we do know is the majority of incidents of anti-Asian violence, the perpetrators are white Americans, although that's not how we see these incidents typically being portrayed, right? We typically see an Asian victim and a Black perpetrator. And I think this really plays into this idea that there are longstanding and irrevocable or insurmountable antagonisms between the Asian and Black community. But we do know that the majority of perpetrators are white Americans.
And more broadly, the social movement Stop Asian Hate, Black Lives Matter, how do they align and distinguish from each other?
Great question. So one, I think it's important to note that Asian Americans have been active in showing support for Black Lives Matter, for the movement. And we've seen that not just in the past year, thinking about, everything that has happened here in the United States, but prior to that as well, we've seen Asian Americans organizing in support of and on behalf of and standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think now thinking about the Stop Asian Hate movement, I think we see similar support from folks who are supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, showing support for Stop Asian Hate movement as well. Again, because it is this understanding that we are thinking about how can we address systems of oppression that have been embedded in our nation, right? How can we address this, and not thinking about trying to play oppression Olympics or who has it worse or who, but rather to fight together against white supremacy. So we see that happening. But I think it's also, no movement is a monolith either. Right. And so there are also folks within the Stop Asian Hate movement who thinking about solutions, right, on how do we ensure our community safety, have talked about increasing policing, right? And so that's why you've seen other folks within the movement say, no, this is not a viable answer, right? This will cause more harm. So it's kind of tricky when we're looking at a movement that is unfolding in real time. And we often like to think about social movements as having kind of one clear goal that everyone is supportive of. But that's not how it happens, right? And especially when we're looking at it unfolding in real time, thinking about people who have been advocating for Asian Americans, long prior to 2021 or even 2020, right? And then thinking about folks who might just now be getting politically engaged, right? And what they might think or what they might want. So you have a lot of different kind of viewpoints or perspectives. And so I think it's difficult, again, as we think about a movement happening in real time with so many different moving parts, and you have folks who are on the ground doing the work, and then you have kind of these media portrayals, which may or may not be accurate.
Let's talk then about remedies. You talked about the reform of hate crimes legislation and the AAPI visibility pledge. Mm-hmm. What more can be done both individually and socially to better buttress our communities against this type of division, both in the immediate and in the longer term? And what changes to public policy or social attitudes you think would be necessary or useful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll start with the individual first. So on the individual level, yes, definitely self-educating about, in this case, about Asian Americans, about Asian American history, about histories of anti-Asian sentiment and histories of anti-Asian legislation, right? So one, doing that corrective work so that we can have a more nuanced and complete understanding of Asians in America, Asian American history, and also racism against Asian Americans, right? So that we can see Asian Americans in their fullness and how they have been in America, how we have shaped America, right? So I think that self-education part is very key. I think also, if we think about within the interpersonal realm, challenging and interrogating our own beliefs. Do we believe in the model minority myth, right? Do we think of Asian Americans through this lens of having made it? In addition, I should say, do we think of Asian Americans as being distinctly foreign? And not American, right? So challenging even our ideas around citizenship and belonging, challenging our own bias, and then also calling out folks who are expressing derogatory or stereotypical views of Asian Americans. So I think that interpersonal piece, even though of course we don't want to think about hate as just within the interpersonal, I think that interpersonal piece is really important when we think about how we see bias and racism happening throughout all aspects of society. So there's that level. Now, when
before we move on with the individual piece, in terms of calling it out, I know it's something we talk about a lot. Like, what does that look like in practice?
Yes, I think there are a few different ways. So, of course, we have to think about the relationships we have with people, right? And what's going to be appropriate to our relationship, right? So, I think in certain ways, when people are making what they might think of as harmless jokes, but they're really stereotypes, not laughing, interrupting that interaction by not laughing, right? By just asking, I don't understand what's funny about that. What's the joke, right? And so that is, I think, a less confrontational way to disrupt, right? In other instances, it might look like having a longer conversation with someone, right? And again, I think it is key to think about the relationship, right? Who is the relationship with? Is it someone who is more of a peer? Is it someone in a position of authority, right? And so thinking about what are different strategies that are appropriate to the relationship you have with that person, but also to whatever it was that they said or did.
Presumably, this is an area too where those who aren't Asians have a big role to play, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I think that's where we always, we see a lot of push for allies, because the thing is, people believe people like them. And so that's part of the power that allies have, is kind of showing up, right? And connecting with someone who is like you, right? But that's also part of the way that as Asian Americans or as Asians, that we're slightly disadvantaged in talking about racism in this way, right? That people might be less likely to believe us, or that people might, accuse us of playing the race card, or things like that. So I think in this case, it is important for us as Asians to speak up, because it really is true, when you don't speak up, people think you agree. And we can take for granted that people, they know how I feel about this issue. But how would they know unless you actually said something? So there is definitely a space and place for us to speak up. But then for folks who are not Asian, I think it is equally important to speak up within folks within your same race community, and to show up as an ally.
All right, and then let's then talk about community or legislative or regulatory responses then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the Hate Crime Act is a great start, and the No Hate Act Amendment are great starts. Again, giving resources, both in way of money, but also in people, right, to tracking hate crimes, to also, reporting out those findings. And I think that is really important. But we also know that a lot of hate crimes go unreported. So we have to think about what are other ways that we can create safety for communities. And I really do think financial resources to underserved communities. We know that folks who are in financially marginalized, right, or lower income communities are going to experience a lot of acts of violence in ways that more resource communities don't, right? Because people need jobs and people need ways to secure their livelihood and take care of their families. And so we see a lot of frustrations and, again, those economic anxieties happening in communities where there aren't funds. So I think funding to under-resourced communities, I think, is a very big step in addition to these pieces of legislation, which I do think are very important as well.
You talked briefly about some ideas that have been floated that you don't think are particularly helpful, one of which is sort of additional policing and that sort of more punitive focus. Are there other ideas that are being raised that you don't think are actually provide a way out of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, definitely that focus on policing is not helpful. Again, if we think about resource distribution and where all the billions of dollars that we spend on policing could be better used in community resources, I think is where, we would get the best return on our money if we thought just purely in, an economic sense. I think other ways that are unhelpful are continuing this framing of Black Asian antagonism. And I think because it further divides our communities and it keeps us stuck in a place where we're continuing to fight against this narrative that is untrue, rather than fighting for justice or finding solutions that could be helpful to both the Asian American community and the Black American community as well. Oh, I think you're muted, Alan.
I am sorry. I'm just wondering about the other movements for equality and inclusion and what might be learned from them. And in particular, the really remarkable progress, I think, of LGBTI communities in fighting for their rights and how rapid some of that progress has happened. I mean, why do you think that those types of reforms have come more rapidly? And do you think there are lessons to be learned from them?
So, well, one, I think those happen more rapidly because they weren't framed around race. So, in the United States, race and racism are very tricky subjects, right? I don't think the United States is reckoning with our racial past or racist past, right? As we've seen in, conversations that's just happened recently in the US. So I think that's why, conversations like the one that we're having today and this whole Diplomacy Delivered series are so important. But I think that's one aspect of why we see LGBTQIA rights kind of happen at such a quick pace, right? Because it wasn't about race. And then we also see what happens when we exclude race from other social justice movements as well. That means that those who are most marginalized, again, go without the need and the justice that they deserve. So I think on one hand, because this is an issue of racism, it makes it more difficult. Any social justice movement where racism is at the center, where we're talking about dismantling white supremacy, is going to face enormous obstacles. But with that being said, I think there is always reason to hope and always reason to continue to fight for justice and to continue to fight for equity. So one, I think there is this that we have to consider is finding common ground with folks, right? So making, our issues, their issues as well, and so that they can see themselves in the issues that we're experiencing. Because again, people fight for those who they see themselves in, right? That they see a joint cause with. And so that's one element or one component is how do we show that what Asian Americans are experiencing or what Asians are experiencing in whatever country are issues that are linked to broader questions of equality, justice, and our shared humanity that you don't have to be Asian to get on board with, right? So I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm trained as a lawyer, but never really practiced. And so there's a tendency to go back to, quite legalistic arguments around human rights and equality. And as compelling as they might be in sort of an academic frame, I'm not sure that they have the same resonance as talking more broadly about sort of the shared aspirations for inclusion and to make meaning in one's life that might have a broader sort of community resonance to them. So of course, US politics has a really international impact. There's I think a more sophisticated vocabulary and conversation that's happening there that's being that other countries are learning from. You see this obviously with Black Lives Matter, but before that with Me Too. What observations, and this is a question that we're getting also from an audience member, Jae-Young Lo, what observations do you think would be useful for Australians to make as we learn from US conversations, US vocabulary, thinking and experience? And as part of that, I guess, as a second part, are there ways the conversation has progressed in the US that you think other countries would do well to avoid?
Great questions. So I think on one kind of, I guess, the positives or lessons that maybe other folks could take from the US is, I think, this commitment to continued cross-racial conversations and cross-racial solidarity, because truly we are all fighting against the same thing, even though we might be thinking about it in different ways, and certainly it's affecting us in different ways. So thinking about white supremacy, right? But I think seeing how communities are committed to continue to reach out to one another, uplift one another, and work alongside one another, I think is really a reason to stay hopeful that change and long-term and really meaningful change can happen. I think potential challenges to try to avoid is to avoid polarization between groups, whether that is racial groups or other, social identities as well, to try to combat against that polarization, which I think can be very difficult because we're often bombarded with messaging, whether from media or even just movies, television, other forms of media as well, that really play up the divisiveness and the divisions. And I think that can be a huge stumbling block, especially as we think about, in the US, there may be instances where you're not interacting cross-racially. And so then where are you getting your views of who people different than you, who they are or what they're like? And we've seen how damaging media portrayals can be, particularly if we think about media portrayals of Black Americans and how they can be damaging and how they really publicize anti-Blackness, right? And those messages really circulate around the globe. So that's why I say I think it's really important to fight against polarization and to really be critical of where we're getting ideas about of other folks.
How does one avoid sort of polarization and division when you're talking about something as sort of visibly divisive as race?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? So I think it comes from a few different ways. So one, I think we have to one, be very committed to our social justice advocacy and very committed to those shared sense of whether it's equality, whether it's inclusion, right? Whether it's these values that we say are central to, our nations and to our national identity. But I think it's also a matter of building relationships and learning how to communicate, which I know can be very difficult in an era where it seems like, everything is a soundbite or, 140 characters or, a caption on social media. But I think learning how to have difficult conversations and learning kind of the general rules of fair communication, right? Of not attacking people, of talking about ideas, of coming to the conversation with a genuine desire to listen, to learn, and to come to shared understanding. And I think that can be a big ask when oftentimes we're so dug into our own perspectives or dug into our own beliefs, and we're really fighting against decades and decades of stories or narratives or ideas about other folks that, we haven't given enough time to really deeply interrogate and challenge. So for sure, that is the big question. How do we come together and talk about these issues that are already, when you even mention it, people are kind of, putting up their guard and approaching it in a combative way in a lot of times. And so I think, in these cases, relationship building, is so important, because who can we have these conversations with? People that we trust, right? People that we've already kind of created a trusting relationship with. And so I think, in this time, as I think about community and how COVID-19 has really emphasized the need for community, I think this is one aspect of that community building as well, that communication and that building of trusting relationships.
Yeah, I mean, you touched upon it a bit then, just around the role of electronic forms of communication and sort of the public square that exists now on Facebook and Twitter. I mean, I think there's a realization now that the mechanics of how those conversations play out isn't always useful because you have a simplification of some of the messages because of the limitations of the medium, the algorithm doing its things, that you hear voices that reinforce rather than challenge your own perspectives. And then lastly, I guess the possibility for actual disinformation or sort of bad faith actors to interrupt the conversations that are happening. I mean, do you have advice on how we can change our individual media engagement or digital consumption habits to better facilitate those types of relationships you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot. because of how much social media is central to our lives, but also for all the reasons that you mentioned, how social media can be an echo chamber, or how social media can even direct us to certain types of information that further even enhances some of our own biases, right? So I think we have to consider social media as a tool that we can use in ways that can be more helpful rather than hurtful. And so some of those ways are, cultivating who is in our friends list or who is in our feed, right? So that thinking about where is trusted information coming from, and what are maybe information sites that might give us more insight in outside of mainstream media, right? So thinking about a media that is particularly in tune to what's happening in the Asian American community, or what's happening, in a variety of different communities that might be of interest. And then also thinking about how can we think about social media etiquette as well. I don't think social media is the place to get lost in the comment section, right? Although you see folks often engaging in, a Twitter war or a comment war about certain topics. But I do think there is space to create meaningful connections with folks through social media. So cultivating the feed, making sure if you are following news sites that they are trusted news sites, and then also, taking into consideration the fact that we don't know the people who are messaging, and you cannot read tone or intention across. So there is a lot of space for miscommunication that's inherently kind of embedded in these social media platforms as well.
Great. Just we've got the last few minutes of our discussion to go. If folks have any last questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Let's do a few quick fire ones. One from the audience: you mentioned a disproportionate number of these anti-Asian incidents are committed against Asian American women. Why is that? What can be done to address this specifically?
Yes. So I think there are a few different reasons why Asian American women are targeted. So one, thinking about ideas of Asian women as being submissive, as being docile. So thinking about, an easy target as well. But then if we think, of course, about the mass shooting in particular, and the racial and sexualized elements of those targets, right? Massage parlors or massage salons, we can think again linked to these broader cultural constructions about Asian women as being, sexually submissive in this case, as being also as being temptresses or sexual sirens that are in some way causing white men in particular to act out in these sexually deviant ways. And these ideas are linked to historic renderings of Asian women as being, sexual, as being disease carrying. And we've seen legislation in the past limiting Asian women's immigration. So thinking about, the Page Act of 1875, one of the first pieces of legislation targeting a specific racial group. So all of these have historic origins. They're not just happening or coming out of nowhere today, but for most folks in the United States, we're not taught this history. So it does seem kind of new.
Another question from Jae-Young Lo: one of the most important and effective ways to minimize and eliminate racism, anti-Asian sentiment, and discrimination is representation and elevating more Asians to senior leadership positions. What are government authorities and corporations in the US doing to address the lack of Asian Americans in top management roles and senior leadership positions?
Great question. So I think representation is super important, but I don't think representation in and of itself is the answer, right? Because we can see Asian Americans who are perpetuating anti-Blackness. We can see Asian Americans that are perpetuating the model minority myth. So Asian Americans in leadership positions or just in more visible positions in and of itself doesn't really solve much if it's just continuing the status quo. But I think to the question of, are there specific strategies or legislation or policies or practices that organizations or the government are implementing to address this? I know that we've seen our current president talk very specifically about wanting to include more Asian Americans in upper level positions of the government, right? And being very mindful of the racial diversity of his cabinet. And then I think for organizations more broadly, I think we are seeing some changes in how Asian Americans are perceived as far as in leadership positions. We often talk about the bamboo ceiling, right? That Asian Americans are underrepresented in Fortune 500 leadership positions. But as far as I know, I don't know of any kind of widespread instituted practices that are addressing Asian American leadership.
And lastly, I'm just mindful of the time. How can folks best connect with you and your work?
Yes. So you can find me on Twitter at SunAh Marie only. And of course, on my website, SunAhMLaybourn.com, where I have information about my current research. So I would love to connect with folks.
Thank you. And mindful of the time, we've now come to the end of the session. Thanks so much, Dr. SunAh Laybourn, for your reflections and thoughts, and just an incredible amount of thinking that's been done on this really important topic. And thank you also for our audience for joining us for these important conversations. Of course, part of broader community discussions happening in the US, in Australia, and around the world, and ones that will hopefully lead to changes in policy and practice. We've mentioned a few resources and organizations in our discussions, and we'll send details of these in a follow-up email, along with other resources that I think both of us can put forward to recommend to you if you want to think more about some of the topics we've discussed. I'm Alan Wu. Thanks very much for joining us, and goodbye for now.